Right now, you are probably resting comfortably inside a quiet and peaceful American suburb. You completely trust the strict building codes of your home and your modern security system. But human history was not always this incredibly secure, predictable, or forgiving to simple mistakes. There was a deeply uncertain time when just standing on a wooden floor was a terrible gamble. The journey through these spectacularly unfortunate medieval disasters is both fascinating and quietly unsettling. Why do we naturally feel so safe in our modern daily lives? And what exactly happens to us when that comfortable illusion is suddenly broken? In the medieval world, a bridge was rarely just a simple path over water. It was treated as solid land, a foundation, the underlying structure that holds everything else up. In Paris, the Pont au Change was a perfect example of this deep architectural optimism. It was not just a crossing, but a crowded, noisy neighborhood suspended completely in the air. Enterprising merchants built heavy wooden houses and busy shops directly on top of the bridge. Families lived their entire lives directly above the flowing river. They ate, slept, and worked with the quiet confidence that the wooden beams beneath them would simply last forever. But physics, the strict natural laws of weight and balance, does not care about human confidence. Every single day, the moisture from the river slowly attacked the supports, the thick wooden pillars carrying the entire structure. Instead of reducing the load, the residents continuously added more weight, packing more goods and more bodies into the tight spaces. They completely ignored the slow, tired sounds of the bending wood. The collapse, when it finally arrived, did not announce itself politely. It was a sudden, violent, and absolute failure of engineering. Without any warning, large sections of the bridge simply gave up. Entire homes, profitable businesses, and the people inside them were thrown instantly into the cold, rushing water below. Panic replaced the daily noise of the market in a matter of seconds. People who had felt completely safe just a moment before suddenly found themselves fighting for their lives, surrounded by the broken pieces of their own living rooms. There was no enemy army attacking the city walls. There was no terrible storm sent from the heavens. It was simply a tragic reminder that gravity will always win when people ask a wet piece of wood to do the impossible. This blind, absolute faith in architecture was not limited to permanent structures like bridges. Temporary buildings, structures made quickly for a short event, carried the exact same deadly overconfidence. During a major festival in the city of Metz, local officials decided to build a massive wooden viewing stand. This was a high, raised platform specifically designed to hold the most important nobles, dignitaries, and wealthy guests. The workers built it quickly, and the elites filled it immediately. Men and women, dressed in heavy, expensive fabrics, climbed the stairs and took their places. They leaned on the wooden railings, completely trusting the hurried work of the local carpenters. As the excitement of the festival grew, the crowd on the platform shifted and moved. Deep inside the wooden joints, the structure began to complain. There were subtle creaks, the quiet, desperate sounds of a building begging for mercy under too much stress. But in a large group, the psychology of the crowd takes over, and personal awareness often disappears. Everyone standing on that stage assumed that someone else had already done the safety calculations. They believed that if the wealthy person standing right next to them was not panicking, then the ground was perfectly safe. That is the dark, silent lie of the crowd. The wooden platform, completely unable to support the massive, combined weight of human ambition, finally shattered. The elegant spectators fell in a chaotic, terrifying wave of broken timber and total confusion. The transition from a joyful upper-class festival to a painful, embarrassing disaster took less than 3 seconds. Many people were seriously injured, and the pride of the local elite was left buried completely under the dusty rubble. They had placed their lives in the hands of cheap wood just to get a better view of a party. However, if you think falling from a wooden stage is the absolute worst way for an important person to lose their dignity, you are greatly underestimating the cruelty of this era. The next event in our journey is so deeply unfortunate and so wonderfully absurd that it will make you question how anyone survived this period at all. Throughout history, men of extreme political power always tried to build strong walls between themselves and everyday danger. They wore incredibly heavy metal armor, lived safely behind thick stone walls, and commanded massive armies. They truly believed their high social rank made them untouchable by the unpredictable cruelty of the natural world. This historical arrogance brings us directly back to those essential questions. Why do we feel safe? And what happens when we are not? For the wealthy ruling class of the Middle Ages, feeling safe was simply a result of their immense social privilege. They assumed sudden tragedy only happened to poor, unprotected people. But the strict laws of physics, the pull of gravity, and sudden bad luck do not care about how much land a person owns. When the universe decides to teach a brutal lesson in human humility, it often chooses the most powerful men to make the loudest possible point. In the summer of 1184, an extraordinary collection of political power gathered in the German city of Erfurt. King Henry VI called a major official meeting to settle a bitter regional dispute. Dozens of princes, proud knights, and high-ranking officials crowded into a single room on the upper floor of a church. Among these figures was Count Heinrich of Schwarzburg, a man widely known for his intense pride. According to historical legends, he recently made a dramatic vow during a heated argument. He confidently declared that if he were wrong, he would rather drown in a toilet than admit defeat. The universe apparently has a very dark sense of humor. As these armored men stood closely together, arguing, the rotting wooden floor beneath their feet reached its absolute breaking point. it completely disintegrated. The floor violently collapsed, crashing through the solid level below, and dropped the entire royal assembly down into the massive cesspit of the local monastery. This was a deep, underground pool of human waste. Suddenly, the metal armor these men wore to protect themselves from enemy swords became their greatest enemy. The heavy steel instantly pulled them deep under the suffocating surface. Around 60 of the most important men in the empire died that terrible day, drowning in pure human filth. Count Heinrich of Schwarzburg tragically learned that you should never make a careless promise, because he sank directly into the exact embarrassing fate he had so proudly joked about. But wait, there is more to this theme, and what happened a few centuries later will completely surprise you. While the disgusting disaster in Erfurt was a brutal failure of old wood and crowds, sometimes the world uses extreme mathematical precision instead of raw gravity. Centuries later, we find another perfect example of ultimate power failing completely against basic physical reality. King Henry II of France loved to publicly demonstrate his physical strength. During a grand celebration in Paris, he organized a massive jousting tournament. Jousting was a dangerous but highly controlled sport where knights rode horses toward each other with long wooden lances. The king wore the most expensive, technologically secure metal armor available. He followed all safety rules, firmly believing his royal status made him completely invincible. He rode his fast horse at full speed toward his opponent, fully expecting an entertaining hit. The two heavy lances struck each other exactly as planned, but then a microscopic calculation of physics went terribly wrong. His opponent's weapon shattered violently upon impact. A tiny, sharp splinter of broken wood exploded upward, traveling through the air at massive speed. It miraculously slipped through the narrow viewing slit in the king's heavy helmet. This small gap was the single vulnerable spot on his protected body, and the sharp wood drove deep into his eye. The most protected man in France was mortally wounded by a cheap piece of flying trash. He suffered in terrible agony for several days before finally passing away. To truly understand the absolute shock of this historical moment, imagine a highly relatable, completely modern American scenario. It would be exactly like watching the president sitting confidently inside the famous armored presidential vehicle. This car is a multi-million-dollar fortress designed to withstand bombs and heavy bullets. Then, completely by random chance, a stray baseball hit by a child from a nearby local park flies through the air. It hits the vehicle's window at the exact perfect angle to shatter the advanced bulletproof glass, causing a fatal injury to the leader inside. It sounds completely impossible, exactly like a poorly written action movie script. But that is exactly how surprisingly vulnerable human leadership has always been. No amount of collected wealth or thick metal armor can ever stop a perfectly timed accident. Kings and proud nobles spent their entire lives trying to control their physical environment. Yet they were ultimately defeated by a rotten floorboard and a broken stick. They learned the hardest possible way that money cannot bribe gravity, and a golden crown cannot negotiate with flying wood. By the later centuries of the Middle Ages, you might assume that simply staying indoors and avoiding heavy metal armor would naturally keep you completely safe. You would be terribly wrong. Sometimes, the most terrifying historical dangers did not come from a collapsing roof or a sharp weapon. They arrived quietly, hiding deep inside the most ordinary, comforting, and trusted things. In medieval France, a wealthy lord decided to host a magnificent feast. This was meant to be a grand display of absolute power and extreme wealth. The heavy wooden doors were locked against the cold. The dining hall was warm, deeply secure, and beautifully decorated. Servants carried massive plates of roasted meats, sweet fruits, and the absolute centerpiece of the meal. This was expensive, high-quality, dark rye bread. Bread was the ultimate symbol of life comfort and human hospitality. It was universally considered the safest, most reliable thing in the entire room. Or so they completely thought. The important guests sat down to eat. They laughed loudly. They shared political stories. They drank rich wine. Then the atmosphere slowly changed. A guest suddenly stopped talking. Someone rubbed their hands nervously. A strange, uncomfortable heat spread through their fingers. Then the real nightmare began. Limbs started to burn with an invisible fire. Muscles twitched uncontrollably. A wealthy knight fell hard to the floor. A noblewoman screamed in pure terror. They saw terrifying visions. They fought invisible monsters in the air. Their bodies twisted in violent, painful convulsions. In a matter of minutes, a highly civilized gathering of the French elite completely collapsed into violent, screaming madness. Nobody had a sword. Nobody was attacking them from the outside. But the entire room was being brutally destroyed from the inside out. To truly grasp the sheer absurdity and shock of this terrifying scene, imagine a very specific modern situation. Imagine an incredibly lavish Thanksgiving dinner hosted at a massive, heavily guarded mansion in the Hamptons. The most powerful American billionaires, politicians, and celebrities are sitting around a perfect, glowing dining table. They are eating a special, wildly expensive artisan bread, baked by a famous celebrity chef. Suddenly, without any warning, instead of politely discussing the stock market, these highly educated billionaires start screaming. They violently shake, cry out, and crawl on the expensive, imported rugs because they are experiencing a massive, collective psychedelic trip. It sounds exactly like a crazy, unrealistic movie scene. But for those medieval French nobles, this terrifying loss of bodily control was completely real, and they had absolutely no idea why it was happening to them. Now listen carefully, because the true cause of this historical disaster is deeply unsettling. The enemy was not a jealous political rival, or a sudden poison slipped into a cup. The killer was completely microscopic. It was a tiny, invisible fungus called ergot. This specific natural fungus loved to grow aggressively on damp rye grain, especially during very wet, rainy agricultural seasons. When the local farmers harvested the infected grain from the fields, they simply did not notice the dark, toxic spots. The busy millers ground it directly into fine flour. The royal bakers baked it into warm, delicious, beautifully shaped bread. The intense cooking process did not destroy the hidden danger. Instead, it delivered a powerful, natural chemical directly into the human nervous system. Today, modern medical science calls this terrifying biological condition ergotism. The toxic fungus contains active chemical compounds that are biologically very similar to modern LSD. It violently attacks the brain, causing extreme hallucinations, and severely restricts blood flow to the arms and legs. In the medieval world, this specific symptom was so painful that it was widely known as Saint Anthony's fire, because the victims felt as if their skin was literally burning from the inside. Of course, in the medieval world, they did not have advanced microscopes. They did not understand the complex biology of fungal infections, agricultural science, or nervous system toxins. When an entire dining hall of wealthy, powerful people suddenly went completely mad, they desperately looked for supernatural answers. They blamed dark magic. They blamed local witches. They truly believed they were being punished by an angry divine force for their hidden sins. Some victims eventually recovered after weeks of suffering, while others tragically lost their limbs to severe gangrene or died from the intense physical shock. This bizarre disaster perfectly highlights the quiet, invisible fragility of medieval life. You did not need to fight in a bloody crusade or stand on a weak wooden bridge to face a terrible catastrophe. Sometimes, all you had to do was sit down in a comfortable chair, completely trust your generous host, and take a simple, innocent bite of freshly baked bread. While poisoned bread and falling buildings were certainly terrifying, the most dangerous weapon in the medieval world was actually the human mind itself. In the heavily fortified towns of Flanders, thick stone walls were carefully designed to keep violent external enemies outside. But those exact same walls easily became deadly traps when pure psychological fear took over. Imagine a perfectly quiet afternoon in the busy town square. Suddenly, a nervous guard hears a loud noise in the distance, or a frightened traveler spreads a completely false rumor about an approaching army. There are no actual soldiers marching toward them. There are no deadly arrows flying through the air. But the terrified human imagination immediately paints a vivid picture of absolute destruction and death. Panic spreads through the population like a wild, uncontrollable fire. The heavy town gates are quickly slammed shut to protect the citizens. But inside those locked walls, a complete psychological collapse happens. Thousands of panicked people rush blindly into the narrow dirt streets. They desperately push, shove, and climb over their own neighbors, trying to find a safe hiding place. In this terrifying, mindless chaos, hundreds of innocent people are brutally crushed, suffocated, and trampled to death. They died violently while trying to escape a phantom enemy that never actually existed. To truly understand this bizarre psychological phenomenon, picture a modern Black Friday shopping event at a massive American mega mall. The huge building is packed tightly with thousands of excited shoppers looking for deals. Suddenly, a careless worker accidentally drops a heavy stack of metal chairs in the crowded food court. The loud, sharp sound echoes aggressively through the building. Someone mistakenly screams that it is a bomb or an active shooter. In mere seconds, pure survival instinct completely deletes all logical thought. The crowd turns into a violent, crushing wave of human bodies, destroying stores and severely injuring each other in a desperate blind race for the exit doors. That is the exact same raw, blinding fear that killed the medieval citizens of Flanders without a single enemy sword ever being drawn. This dangerous psychological fragility did not always look like a violent, fast-moving stampede. Sometimes, collective mental stress produced a disaster that was much slower, much stranger, and deeply exhausting. In July of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, a woman named Frau Trophea stepped out of her house and simply began to dance in the street. There was no happy music playing anywhere, and there was absolutely no reason to celebrate. She just kept moving her body continuously and uncontrollably. Within a single month, this bizarre behavior infected the fragile minds of about 400 other people. They joined her in the streets, dancing wildly and obsessively under the hot summer sun. Modern medical historians, including researchers writing for The Lancet, now believe this was a massive case of stress-induced psychological illness. It was triggered by extreme local starvation, terrible living conditions, and endless disease. The human brain, completely overloaded by daily medieval suffering, simply broke down and forced the physical body into endless, manic motion. The local authorities completely misunderstood the situation and made it worse. They actually hired professional musicians and built stages, foolishly believing the dancers just needed to get the urge out of their system. This terrible decision only encouraged more fragile people to join the madness. People danced until their leather shoes completely wore away. They danced until their bare feet bled heavily on the rough cobblestones. Eventually, many of them dropped dead from sheer physical exhaustion, massive strokes, and sudden heart attacks. Their own desperate minds had essentially trapped them inside a bizarre, invisible prison of movement. But here is where the story gets even more incredible. Because while the human mind could certainly create its own terrible internal disasters, It was absolutely nothing compared to what happened when Mother Nature finally decided to wipe the map clean. When we look back at history, it is very easy to focus entirely on human mistakes. We analyze badly built bridges, deeply flawed military strategies, and the wild, unpredictable nature of mass panic. We naturally assume that if humans were just slightly smarter or more careful, they could have easily prevented disaster. But this brings us back to our central questions once again. Why do we feel safe? And what happens when we are not? The medieval world provides a very clear, deeply humbling answer. Sometimes, complete safety is absolutely impossible because the natural world simply refuses to cooperate. No matter how much political power you gather, or how thick you build your city walls, the raw forces of nature cannot be negotiated with, bribed, or intimidated. When a river or an ocean decides to move, human ambition instantly becomes completely irrelevant. In the year 1190, Emperor Frederick I, Barbarossa, was perhaps the most powerful and feared ruler in all of Western Europe. He commanded a massive, highly disciplined army. He survived countless brutal battles and complex political betrayals. He was actively leading the Third Crusade, marching a massive force across rough terrain toward the Holy Land. His men respected him deeply and believed he was chosen by God to win. But all of that carefully constructed power ended abruptly at the edge of the Salif River in modern-day Turkey. The river was not particularly wide, and it certainly was not an organized enemy army. It was just cold, fast-moving water. The emperor, wearing extremely heavy metal armor, attempted to cross the rushing river on horseback. The exact details are lost to history, but the tragic result is undeniable. The powerful current was simply stronger than his horse. The heavy armor, designed specifically to save his life in combat, immediately dragged him straight to the bottom. In a matter of minutes, the most powerful man in the Holy Roman Empire drowned in an unremarkable stretch of water. The psychological impact on his massive army was absolute devastation. Without their legendary leader, military morale completely collapsed. Thousands of soldiers simply turned around and went home. An entire historical crusade planned for years and funded by massive wealth fell apart almost instantly. The river, of course, did not care about politics or religion. It just kept flowing quietly, completely indifferent to the fact that it had just violently changed the course of world history. However, a single river claiming an emperor is one thing. The ocean deciding to swallow entire towns is something else entirely. In the bitter winter of 1362, the people living along the coasts of the North Sea in England, Germany, and the Netherlands felt relatively secure. They had built complex systems of dikes and earthen walls to hold back the cold water. They believed their engineering had finally tamed the wild ocean. Then came the Grote Mandrenke, a massive, terrifying storm system, now known as the Great Drowning of Men. The intense winds howled continuously for days, pushing a massive wall of seawater directly toward the coast. The carefully built dikes did not hold. They shattered completely under the immense pressure. The cold, dark ocean violently rushed inland, sweeping away everything in its path. Entire coastal villages were completely erased from the map in a single night. Tens of thousands of people drowned in their own beds. The rich, bustling island settlement of Rungholt, a major center of local trade, sank entirely beneath the freezing waves, becoming a lost legend. When the terrible storm finally passed, the survivors looked out at a completely unrecognizable landscape. The ocean had aggressively redrawn the map of Europe. It was a brutal, undeniable reminder that human beings do not own the land. They only borrow it temporarily until the water decides it wants it back. By the middle of the 14th century, Europe had already seen many terrible local tragedies. People were quite used to falling buildings, dangerous rivers, and strange village sicknesses. But all of those events were relatively small and isolated. They usually only affected a single town, a single powerful family, or a single army. Then everything changed completely in the year 1346. The ultimate peak of medieval fragility began just outside the walls of a busy trading city called Kaffa. This city was located on the distant edge of the Black Sea. It was a massive commercial hub where merchants brought expensive silk and rare spices from the east to sell to the west. However, the city was currently trapped in a tense, frustrating military siege. A large army, known as the Golden Horde, surrounded the high stone walls. The attackers desperately wanted to take control of the rich trading center. But suddenly, the attacking soldiers started dropping dead. They were not dying from arrows or defensive swords. A mysterious, violent fever was quickly destroying their military camp. The generals of the attacking army were incredibly frustrated. They watched their own men die in terrible pain. They knew their long military campaign was failing. So they made a desperate and brutal decision. It was a choice that perfectly highlights human short-sightedness. They ordered their surviving soldiers to load the infected, rotting corpses of their dead comrades onto massive wooden catapults. With a loud crack, they launched these diseased bodies high through the air. The dead bodies crashed violently over the walls and landed directly inside the crowded city streets of Kaffa. The attackers simply wanted to win a local war. They thought they were just scaring the defenders with a disgusting trick. They had absolutely no idea that they were actually unlocking a massive biological weapon. Now listen carefully, because this exact moment triggered the most devastating chain reaction in human history. Inside the city walls, pure panic exploded almost instantly. The smell of death filled the narrow streets. The wealthy Genoese merchants living in Kaffa decided they had to escape immediately. They packed their expensive cargo in a rush. They boarded their fast trading ships. They sailed quickly toward the perceived safety of the Mediterranean Sea. They looked back at the city and truly believed they had successfully survived a terrible nightmare. But they were entirely wrong. They had unwittingly brought a silent, invisible killer along with them. The deadly infection was hiding quietly inside the fur of thousands of black rats and tiny fleas on their ships. To fully understand the terrifying speed of this disaster, think about a modern global supply chain. If a massive cargo ship gets stuck in a major shipping canal today, it can instantly disrupt businesses across the entire United States. Store shelves go empty, and factories stop working almost overnight. Medieval commercial trade routes operated with that exact same powerful connectivity. When the merchant ships from Kaffa finally docked at busy ports in Italy, the infected rats quickly ran onto the docks. They mixed perfectly with the local city rats. The fleas jumped from the animals directly to the human dock workers. From there, the disease traveled aggressively along the busy highways of commerce. It moved from major port cities to small inland villages. It followed the exact paths of human trade, curiosity, and greed. The sickness became known as the Black Death, and it was absolutely merciless. The symptoms were deeply terrifying to witness. Victims quickly developed dark, painful swellings on their necks and arms. They suffered burning fevers and terrible physical weakness. Most people died within just 3 to 5 days. The medieval medical community was completely powerless against it. Experienced doctors tried bleeding their patients. They burned sweet-smelling herbs to clean the bad air. They prayed loudly for divine forgiveness. Nothing they did mattered at all. The plague did not respect political borders. It did not care if you were a wealthy king sitting in a strong castle or a poor farmer working in a muddy field. It simply moved forward, consuming human life with a cold, mechanical efficiency. Entire prosperous cities were quickly reduced to absolute silence. Markets were abandoned. Farms were left completely empty. There were simply not enough living people left to bury the dead. The historical statistics are incredibly difficult to fully imagine. In just a few short years, this single pandemic wiped out between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire European population. Tens of millions of human lives vanished completely. It was the ultimate display of human fragility. A careless, angry military tactic outside a single trading post eventually collapsed an entire continent. Sometimes, human beings create their own worst nightmares. When the invisible storm finally passed, the world was left incredibly quiet, forever changed by the terrible consequences of a single bad decision.